All right. Workhorse Book Club, month number one. For this month, we have The Epic of Gilgamesh. So this book, it is very short. Like it took an hour to read, maybe.
Yeah.
I read this in ninth grade English, but that was before I like cared about school, so I really didn't like
hmm
pay attention. So I really didn't remember like any of it. But I also did not remember just how short it was. So that was also
Yeah.
fascinating. It's just like
Yeah.
it's
You
brief.
hear about, I mean, everybody knows what it is,
Hmm.
like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like one of
Yeah,
the first
yeah,
literary works ever written. And then you read it, and it's like 60 pages.
yeah. I mean, it
And I
makes
mean, there's
sense.
a lot
It's
that happens. And there's a lot that happens in 60 pages, but
yeah. Well, if
it
it's
definitely
if it's
is.
gonna be carved into clay tablets, like you can't really.
Yeah, exactly.
You gotta be concise with your language because it takes you. I don't know how long it takes to carve into clay, but it's not like
Yeah.
typing on a Google Doc.
One thing I thought was interesting too, I don't know if you read in the introduction, but um, the epic that we have now is just like a giant, there's like a bunch of different tablets with a bunch of different
Hmm.
stories, um, and a bunch of different versions of the stories. And it's just like an accumulation of different tablets that they sort of mesh together in one epic,
Hmm.
which I
Yeah,
thought was fascinating. Like there's different aspects of the story that are on different tablets. It's not just like one tablet with the story.
yeah.
There's like different versions.
Hmm. Yeah, it's just pieced together, and then they keep finding new pieces. So like, I forget how. I should know his name. He's like one of the main lecturers or like researchers on Gilgamesh. But I was in this one lecture, and he's saying that like the British Museum and like other museums will just have like thousands of clay tablets. Like they have them, but they haven't like translated them all. So there could just be a lot
Mhm.
more to the story that they just like haven't translated
Exactly.
yet. Because it's like
Yeah.
this story, like they just found it pretty recently, like in the last like 100 years or something. So it's not complete, but this is like the most complete version they have right now. So
But I
yeah.
think that gets into something that's important with myth, because this is really the first time I've gotten into like reading and looking at a myth.
Mm.
Um, and they're kind of difficult to read in some aspects because you're not reading literalistically. Like there's some things that are historical, but they're turned into sort of like a symbolically rich historicity.
Hmm.
So like it's almost just like a communication of what's going on in the culture through story.
Hmm.
So it's fascinating because there are Michael Sergru talked about this in one of the lectures I
Hmm.
watched from him. He's like, um, it's not like we're reading a complete fantasy. Like some of the events that you see in the epic, like the killing of Humbaba in the cedar forest,
Hmm.
for example. Like he's like maybe there's a tribe to the north that lived in the cedar forest, controlled the cedar forest. They had a clash with Uruk, which is the city which Gilgamesh is the king of.
Hmm.
Maybe they had a clash with them, and then um, through the creation of this myth, they sort of established this symbolically rich notion of Humbaba, the guardian of the forest, who was placed there by the gods,
Right.
and stuff like that, which I thought was pretty interesting because, um, I mean, you think of myth and it's like, oh, archaic human beings, not really smart, um, but it's pretty fascinating that they have this way of sort of encoding tradition and history and basically every other domain of what we would call science now into like one
Hmm.
narrative,
Right.
basically.
No, that's definitely true. That's like so two things. One, like the first part you were saying, like reading it not as complete fantasy, but like reading different ways. What it's really nice about the book being so short is that you can read it a couple times with a different perspective each
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Like the first time I read it, I just read it as kind of like more as a myth, like just reading the story to
hmm
try to like pick out like themes. Um, how do people interact with gods? Like who are the characters? Almost like reading it more just as a narrative. But then you can go
hmm
back and read it. I read it like more like symbolically, like reading it as like how I understand like Old Testament stories to function as like stories that
Sure.
maybe have like some element of historical truth, but are more so like extended allegories for moral teachings. So I read it like that, but then you could
Yeah.
also read it, like you said, like as more of a historical document. Like what does like what is Gilgamesh's relationship to the water or the land or other
Sure.
people, or to the flood? Like what does that say about the historical people of what is it, modern day Iraq? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, just that. Like you can just read the story with a different mental state, and it comes out in a different way.
Mhm.
And then kind of the second thing of what you were talking about of like this could be like the story of Humbaba could be like a reflection of an actual historical event, and it's somewhat connected. But the idea of like meta stories, how like this story is
Yeah. Yeah.
thousands of stories and perspectives like distilled down into one story. So it I guess obviously started as an oral tradition or like a oral retelling of actual events, and just say there's like 1,000 different people telling this version of a story, and it just gets
Yeah.
distilled down into maybe like one person writes it down, and then another person writes on a different version, and then those two versions get combined or like one takes over. So it's just like this long process of whittling away this story into like the very the condensed version, but the condensed version is like footnote and like hyperlink to other kinds of the story, to where each word is like it's there for a reason. It's not
Yeah.
just because one person wrote it down. It's because so many different people said the same version or valued the same version that included this one word, and that one word is what made it into the version of it that we have. And so it's not so just that each part of the story is valuable and has something beyond just like it being a word that tells the story. There's something more to it. So yeah.
It's a synthesis of thousands of years of culture. And you're
Right.
right, it's like distilled into one thing. And you can see that. Um, I think at the beginning, one thing might be good to start with is the prologue.
Ah, yes.
So many times, like, just like read over it, right? But um, a lot of the lectures I was looking at, they're talking about really look at the prologue because they're sort of directing you into a framework of how to read it. So here they describe Gilgamesh, characterized as wise, all-knowing, saw mysteries, knew secret things, and then sort of mysteriously talks about how he brought them a tale of the days before the flood. We'll get into that later. Um, yeah, and they describe his body as perfect, just a really physical characterization of Gilgamesh. But then the last paragraph, they really direct you towards the city of Uruk itself, and sort of in an interesting way characterize the walls of Uruk, the temple, what the temple is built out of. Like one quote is, "The outer wall where the cornice runs, it shines with the brilliance of copper, and the inner wall it has no equal. Touch the threshold." So it's inviting you in to touch Uruk itself, and to me that sort of struck like Uruk, right, is the symbol of civilization in the story. Like it is the epitome of civilization. Gilgamesh is the epitome of a civilized human being. So it's really, and then in a historical aspect too, maybe it's like a sort of advertisement for civilization itself, sort of domestication of the human being. But I thought that was an interesting way to approach the story, because you have in the text, like, it's telling you literally to look and touch the walls of Uruk, see what it's made of, and regard the foundation, examine the masonry. Is it not burnt brick and good? So I think that's one way it sort of frames itself. You have to be open to letting it sort of frame itself for you, because it's really easy for us with our like vocabulary of idioms and our vocabulary of modern day symbolism to just, like, project onto the myth. And that's one thing that I was doing a lot. Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? But the one thing I really thought was interesting was how the text sort of almost interpreted itself. If you
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I really liked about what you talked about is how physical this prologue is. And I noted parts of that. I
yeah
mostly noted that in relation to like the descriptions of Gilgamesh. But also I was thinking about this prologue in comparison to like the opening to the Iliad. And so the opening of the Iliad, like the
mhm,
first line is sing goddess. Oh come on! I knew this before. Sing goddess the fortune. Shoot, I had it in my head and I forgot it. But it's like you invoke the gods, and then it's sing goddess the
yep
anger of Peleus' son Achilles and his destruction, which brought pain thousandfold upon the Achaeans. But it's like invoking the gods
mhm,
is the first thing that happens in the Iliad. That's what the storyteller does. But this opens with, I will proclaim to the world the deeds of Gilgamesh. Like there's no gods there. And then throughout this whole prologue, the gods create Gilgamesh, but Gilgamesh is
mhm,
physical. And what's important about Gilgamesh is that he is physical. And then with Uruk,
yeah
what's important is that it's physically fortified and that it's there, and that it's
yeah
not like a divine realm. It's like this is the epitome of humanity and like the physical humanity.
sure
And then I feel like you're kind of alluding to like Uruk as civilization in relation to the animal world, and that's what happens with Enkidu.
yeah
And we'll get to Enkidu later, but kind of Gilgamesh and Gilgamesh's city as the most human thing there is, the most physical, like the pinnacle of physical evolution, basically, into a
yeah
species of animal that can create physical fortification. That's not it's not animal and it's not God. It's human, and that's what's important about it. So yeah.
yeah yeah. The one thing I had drawn from my book here was like um, God's arrow, Gilgamesh arrow, Uruk.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like Uruk was the fruit of Gilgamesh's labor and perfection, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the gods creating Uruk itself. It said the seven sages laid its foundations. Not exactly sure who the seven sages are, but
Right.
it doesn't specifically say like the gods laid its foundations.
Right. No,
So I
that's
think it's
also
talking
important.
about like the humanely created aspect of civilization itself, like you were saying, being the pinnacle of sort of light or like rationality or like perfection, because they're mentioning his the ability of his intellect, the fact that he knew all things, he knew secrets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting contrast between that and Uruk. Um, so now we can get to the next.
Well, we could go into Enkidu a little bit because we just brought him up.
Yeah,
Because yeah, so
yeah,
that's like a base description of Gilgamesh, and then in some ways, like Enkidu is the foil of Gilgamesh. He's like the opposite in some ways, and then in
yeah,
other ways, he's like the same, just has a different
yeah,
name. But the idea that he's what is this on page 63, the top. He was innocent of mankind. He knew nothing of the cultivated land. So
yeah,
there's a lot there. So he's innocent. Like he doesn't have. I mean, that means he doesn't have guilt, but maybe he doesn't have knowledge of humanity. He doesn't have any connection. He doesn't have like a family. He doesn't have like nothing about him is connected to mankind, even though he's a human. He's like completely separate. So that's one. And then he knew nothing of the cultivated land, like agriculture. Like he doesn't participate in human society activities. He lives off of the land,
yeah,
and that's different than growing food or domesticating animals. He's completely wild, and so he's like the opposite of this like fortified structure of civilization that Gilgamesh lives in. That was one description that I
yeah.
thought was important.
My favorite part of the characterization, I think it's really telling, is he literally lives with the wild animals.
Mm-hmm.
Like he grazes on grass with them. They don't see him and see human being. I'm afraid of you. They see animal, but
Mm-hmm.
yet he's still a human being. Um,
Right.
the one thing too that we should preface is Enkidu is the result of Gilgamesh's tyrannical actions, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, Gilgamesh is described as this amazing person, but a tyrant, oppressive. um, and then so the people cry out to the gods. The gods grant their wishes and send Enkidu, who is sort of opposite, the dark part of Gilgamesh's
Mm-hmm.
nature, maybe. Um, but one to sort of offset him, as you said earlier. So yeah, and then it talks literally about how like the gods made him out of clay, like pinched the ears, dipped the hands in water, and pinched off the clay. It's really fascinating imagery. But another interesting thing is how Enkidu sort of was at odds with the hunters and the trappers in the wilderness while he was there. He filled in their holes. He destroyed their traps. And then when the trapper sees Enkidu for the first time, he's like frozen. Like that was something that really stood out to me, like frozen, just absolutely awestruck by this guy. And it was interesting to me because like when you have to face an aspect of yourself that's kind of hidden or like uncivilized or dark, it's scary. Right? Like you have to face a part of yourself that's sort of unconscious or drives you in a sort of subliminal way. It's terrifying. And I think Enkidu is sort of portrayed as like a distinct person from Gilgamesh, but also like the darker part of him. Not dark in a negative sense, but dark in like a unconscious, not rational sense.
Right. No, that was one thing I was going to bring up earlier of this, like an understanding of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. This is like a completely like metaphorical reading of the text of them being like like symbolically two parts of the self. Like Gilgamesh is like in our like modern language we say like the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Like Gilgamesh is the thinking mind that lives in society, that cares about social status, that like he cares about glory. Like his big thing is having his name be immortal. And then Enkidu being like the animal side of the self that's like purely momentary, that's we'd say like impulse driven, but in a way that's oriented towards survival. And then the largest description of the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is that like they're best friends, like they love each other, like they're more than even best friends, like they're like lovers, but so whatever that means. But that, and so like in that understanding, that kind of means that the conscious mind, which in some way could be like the divine mind, because Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, and so they kind of like the gods, their not I guess like their future and past orientation, because I guess they're immortal, like they have this non-present orientation. That aspect of Gilgamesh, that aspect is Gilgamesh, and that aspect of the self has to love the animal side of the self. Like the divine mind and the animal mind have to love each other, and they have to basically respect each other's knowledge. Because if one becomes too tyrannical, like when Gilgamesh becomes too tyrannical, that's when that's when Enkidu comes in to kind of like counteract him. But then I suppose the opposite could also be true. Like if the animal side of the self, like if Enkidu becomes too powerful, then the opposite has to be true. Then the divine mind has to kind of step in and counteract it and fight it. But ideally they love each other in kind of this balance where like they literally would like die for each other. And that's kind of, I guess the thesis is like that's the ideal mental orientation of the divine loving the animal.
Yeah, and that connects to what you said earlier about like contrasting the momentary nature of the sort of animal mind and the forward-thinking, rational, subdued, sort of conscious aspect of Gilgamesh. Enkidu doesn't know anything about the cultivated land, and I think you can look at cultivated land as like a literal, in the literal sense, like yes, farming, but also the cultivation of reason and things that are sort of forward in the nature of a human being, the cultivation of ideas, the cultivation of civilization, the cultivation of things in your life that you need to sort of subdue parts of your nature to be able to go in a forward direction. And Enkidu, like he fills in all the trappers. Like he is occupied with surviving and just existing. While Gilgamesh is occupied with being a king, being like a rational human being in society, sort of what we would conceive now as like a normal human being. He was the epitome of that sort of next generation of forward-thinking, rational human beings.
Right.
I think that's an interesting contrast too with the ways they're characterized.
Right.
But then you get into the domestication, and there's some very interesting like thematic branches that start to occur, like the fact that he's domesticated by a temple prostitute, and the way that he's domesticated is through sex, which is fascinating because I didn't know this, but like I don't know if this is really accepted among scholars, but temple prostitution was actually pretty common in Near Eastern ancient religion.
Yeah.
Because the sexual act was sort of thought of as associated with fertility, and but it's also interesting because like he belonged to like the prostitute belonged to the temple, which is an institution of the civilization, and sort of took in Enkidu and started to make him understand relationality and the estrangement of his own existence, which is fascinating because you see sex developed in so many different ways than how we conceive it now. It's like sex as domestication, just like relating of existences, like acknowledgement that you are a different existence than I am.
Sure.
And how that sort of makes Enkidu aware of his humanity, his estrangement. Like and then like you were talking, like what does it mean to be human in this sort of fall of Enkidu?
Right. What I first thought about the domestication through sex is the purpose of the sex, because animals have sex, but it's for the purpose of reproduction. Where the sex between Enkidu and the temple prostitute it's not for reproduction, like it's for pleasure.
Yeah.
And so that action, it's not like it's in some ways like an inversion of what the sexual act is like biologically designed, or like its purpose. It's not for the purpose of the act, which in some way kind of goes against what we were just talking about of like a defining aspect of humanity and civilization as being forward thinking. Like cultivating land is an action in the present, where like tilling the soil doesn't do anything for you right now, but it's an action of knowledge that in the future this action will have benefit. And like setting up a trap for an animal, that's with the plan and the knowledge that in the future you may get meat out of it, but right now it doesn't do anything for you. But then that kind of is almost like the opposite of the sexual act here, that there is no like meaningful purpose of the sex beyond the present, and that it being pleasurable in the present. And so I'm trying to figure out how those two ideas kind of work together, because those both make sense, that those are like defining aspects of humanity, like having sex for pleasure and acting for the future. But those two are kind of opposed in how they're set up. But then also, I guess you can jump back into it, but then anything else that, other things that domesticate or civilize Enkidu that are like clothing and food. And those are a little bit more obvious, like animals don't wear clothing. And then animals don't cultivate food, like they don't have bread and they don't make alcohol. So like things like that make a little more sense, just that those are like defining physical pieces of humanity. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and hearing you talk about it like that, it's fascinating because I didn't really think of it in terms of pleasure when I was reading it, but that makes sense because, I mean, you hear it described and like, it's definitely for like Enkidu was pleased. Like, you know, it is about pleasure. But the other thing was after he is domesticated, he describes like his limbs have grown weak. He has wisdom, like he's burdened with wisdom. He's sort of frozen with knowledge. Like he has so much wisdom that he's also burdened with the inability to act. So I think what we're seeing might be like the beginning of the delayed gratification that we're talking about. But it's also fascinating because, it doesn't really make sense. Because if you were being a fully rationalistic, forward-thinking, delayed gratification human being. You would just have sex for offspring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there's nothing beneficial about what just happened between Enkidu and the temple prostitute
Mm-hmm.
in terms of producing the greatest outcome in the future,
Right.
which is fascinating because that's right. I think it's hard to make that into a coherent idea or a coherent theme
One,
because it really isn't outside right now.
you know, one thing that kind of makes sense to me right now is like that's obviously like not a paradox, but it's like a conflicting statement. Like a forward thinking
Well,
human with knowledge of the future doing an action that's purely for pleasant or present pleasure, and that,
mm,
that in some way feels very similar to Gilgamesh's quest for immortality later on.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
there's two forms of immortality for him. Like there's the glory of his name, like inscribing your name into the brick that will last forever, and like writing your name in a new place. Like that's like immortality of your name. But then there's also immortality, like literal immortality that he tries to seek, and that feels almost like a similar conflicting statement where it's like he simultaneously understands that he will die, and that's terrifying, so he has to inscribe his name into stone. But at the same time, he's trying to do the opposite of that and live and try to find a way to live forever. And it's obviously not like the
Mm,
exact like same like comparison, but there's something in that like an inherent part of being human is living within these paradoxical conflicting statements where we know there is a future, but we don't know what it is. And so that's just kind of like this constant problem that you have to live with. That there's actions to take in the future, that to take right now that you don't know what will happen in the future, even though you know there will be a future. Those just feel
mm.
similar to me.
Yeah, I mean, and then you see that at the beginning of the forest journey too, like when Gilgamesh, he has this just like unquenchable desire to go do something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna go kill Humbaba, and everybody in Uruk is like, dude, you're crazy,
Don't
like,
do that.
no. But he's like, yes, I'm gonna do it, and then yeah, he just um, it doesn't really like I'm not really sure if there is a specific benefit that they talk about to killing Humbaba.
That was one thing. Is
Um,
like I don't remember like Humbaba's not doing anything bad. He's just the guardian of the cedar forest. He just
yeah,
is ferocious and is intimidating. But like I don't see him like causing destruction anywhere unless I miss that. But it's kind of this quest without like the only purpose is to glorify Gilgamesh's name. There's not a greater purpose for to, like benefit Uruk. Um,
yeah. I
I
mean,
don't know. Yeah,
he describes Humbaba as like because of the evil that is in the land, we will go to the forest and destroy the evil.
yeah,
Like, but he's not inflicting any damage earlier in the story. So either there's something missing in the narrative, or
sure.
like,
Hmm.
um, but you can kind of see this in the sort of paradox that is human existence itself. Like, what's the point of action if it all comes to nothing?
Sure. Hmm.
You know, like there's a paradox there, but yet we still act because what's the alternative?
Hmm. Yeah,
You know,
that's fair.
like um, it is a paradox when you make it one, and that's why like it's confusing to some of the people in the city, the sort of quote unquote normal people.
Hmm.
Um, like Gilgamesh is like, I got to do this. Like I have to do this. I have
Yeah,
to go defeat this evil
yeah,
possible to defeat. I have to write my name in the brick. Um, and they're like, dude, no, you can't do that. Like that's crazy. And um, it's kind of like Nietzschean in a way,
mm,
because you're going out to some sort of unknown territory that where nobody's ever been before,
hmm,
and which everybody thinks is horrifying and impossible to sort of domesticate or defeat.
yeah,
And yet Gilgamesh is like, bring it on. like I have to do this,
Mm-hmm.
even though um, it's sort of like a paradox because what's the point?
Sure. I mean, you also could just understand it as like the first iteration of manifest destiny. Like
Yeah.
we got civilization, and then the cedar forest is just uncivilized. So like, of course, we have to go civilize that. That is the purpose of humanity, is having the light of civilization, and then the purpose is to spread that. And so like it doesn't.
Mm.
It's not like there's some evil to like. There's not like there's some evil act to counteract. It's that the fact that there is no civilization in the cedar forest, that is evil, because it's not good civilization. And so the opposite of this good civilization is the evil unknown, and that the purpose of our lives is to go and conquer that. And so like it makes sense in like a, I don't know, a larger sense of history, of how history is
Yeah.
unfolded. But
I mean, and then you see his desire, like his mom is like pleading with the gods, like, why did you instill this spirit into him? Like, why did you make his heart restless? And this is also the first, I could mention, this is also the first part in the story where we start to see like sacrifice and the sort of like pleading to the gods, pleading with the gods, asking them, supplicating, which is fascinating because there's some similar language here, like spotless sacrifice. He sacrifices his tears, and then the gods decide to help him on the journey. He is graced with like winds and a bunch of other divine aids. Um, but yeah, it's Gilgamesh talks about he's just like all in, like he's prepared to die for this. Um, and I actually wrote, you're gonna laugh. I wrote in my notes, I was like, maybe this is similar to like Abel in the story of Cain and Abel in the Old Testament, where like Abel is like accepting of his destiny. He's giving the first fruits to God in that sense, but he's giving his life over to his calling, basically. And I thought that was kind of like a similar, maybe similar theme.
And then in the sacrifice at the top of 72, Gilgamesh took up a kid, and white without spot and a brown one with it. He held him against his breast, and he carried them into the presence of the sun. He took in his hand his silver scepter, and he sacrifices two goats, like two baby goats, to the gods. And one is like perfect, like one is white without spot, and one is a brown one with a spot. I don't know what that means, but that just seems important. Like that detail is included.
Yeah.
Like something about, like it's not a fully grown goat. It's a kid. It's like a baby goat with the potential to become a larger goat. So it's like sacrificing the future goat. So that's like one thing. But then one of them being, I was thinking like maybe like as a metaphor for Gilgamesh and Enkidu, like Gilgamesh being the divine white without spot goat, and then Enkidu as like the brown spotted goat, and like they're literally going to sacrifice their lives to glorifying the gods of civilization, because the gods exist beyond Uruk, but I don't like see them as like communing with the wild animals. Like when Enkidu was living in the wilderness, he didn't know there were gods, but Gilgamesh knows there's gods because he lives in civilization. So the gods have this special connection to civilization, and so Gilgamesh is like, and Enkidu are going to like symbolically and literally sacrifice themselves in glory of the gods of civilization. So yeah, but that makes sense of the Abel allegory, because that's pretty similar.
Yeah. So then Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat Humbaba.
They do.
And obtain glory. One thing I want to mention in the forest while they're going to Humbaba is the importance of dreams and the importance of going up the mountain.
Yeah.
Because that's literally everywhere it's everywhere in like scripture, it's everywhere in myth. symbolism. Like going up the mountain just means like prayer
Yep.
or meditation or going to some spiritual high. I mean, if you think about it in the sense of just like going up the mountain, you can see everything around you. So there's so many times where they go up the mountain and then they have some dream that is foresight into the future, and just fascinating. Like I don't really know what that means, but they just talk about it all the time. Like it happens so much, and they have to like interpret each other's dreams, which is fascinating. Like I didn't really know what to make of it.
Well, one thing that
I don't know if you
okay.
yes.
Well, just like a brief thing with the dreams. So one professor who I like a lot, Wesley Cecil, he puts out a lot of good lectures, and he has this one on, I think it's more on like the language of ancient Sumerian, but he talks about Gilgamesh a little bit, and he mentions exactly that like dreams are just so important in this story, and that they're always just having like the most vivid, crazy dreams, and part of that is just like a reality of pre-technological civilization. Like
Sure.
they're not being bathed in blue light before bed. Like they're going to sleep with the sunset. They're waking up with the sunrise. There's no artificial light, all of that. So partly like their dream quality was probably just a lot more intense than ours. Like they were just having like psychedelic dreams just because they weren't being like, their sleep quality was just better. So I just thought that was funny that he brought that up in one of his lectures, like talking about the effect of light on your dreams. It's like, yeah, if you go to sleep and if you go camping, like and you like have like a decent sleeping bag going on, you're probably going to sleep a lot better because you're actually sleeping with the sun. So that makes sense.
Yeah. Did he talk about in the lecture like why their dreams are like a foretelling of what's to come?
No, not really. Just that like dreams were probably a lot more powerful, and also like, what is a dream? Like a dream is the most insane thing ever. Like you go to sleep and you just hallucinate. Like the dreams I have are wild, and if I didn't, I don't know, if I was a more like spiritual person, it probably would be like, that is the gods showing me a vision. It makes sense to like to think things that you aren't consciously thinking. That feels like a divine intervention.
All right. So they defeat Humbaba, and it releases. It's crazy. It like releases chaos everywhere. And then the gods decide to send the bowl of heaven, which was like famine for 7 years, hardship for the civilization. It's fascinating because like Humbaba is described as the evil, right? He's the protector of the forest, the guardian of the forest, and then they kill him and they unleash all this energy and all this stuff that's just happening, and then it's just desolation for like 7 years.
Well, the gods are upset with them. They're like, why did you kill Humbaba? They because they bring, what do they just like bring the body of Humbaba before Enlil, and Enlil raged at them. Why did you do this thing? From henceforth may the fire be on your faces, may it eat the bread that you eat, may it drink where you drink. And so he just like, Enlil the god is just like, why did you kill Humbaba? You did not need to do that. But and then the next paragraph is like a praise of Gilgamesh. Sorry, this is on 84. O Gilgamesh, king and conqueror of the dreadful blaze, wild bull who plunders the mountain, who crosses the sea, glory to him, and from the brave the greater glory is Enki's. I think Enki's the other god. So it's simultaneously like the gods are mad at Gilgamesh for doing this, but also like the human orator who's telling the story is like still glorifying Gilgamesh's name. Like, you did this great, incredible thing. It was so great that the gods couldn't even understand it. Like you enraged the gods with your greatness, because maybe in some way because like you were rivaling them, like because you did this incredible thing that maybe not like rivaling their strength, but like rivaling their intellect, that you did something that the gods didn't understand, and that's incredible.
Yeah, and that you were able to take chaos and sort of make it submit to you.
Sure. Yeah.
Through the symbolic like death of Humbaba in the forest. you were able to crush the powers of evil and unleash and then subdue them sort of under the powers of humanity, under the powers of the gods, um, which unleashes a famine,
Yeah.
which is fascinating because, I mean, I took that as one way. One way I took that was once you sort of go that extra step and maybe subdue some powers of chaos, and um, you start to make something of them. Like for a while, it doesn't work at all,
Yeah.
and this kind of confusing even to me as I'm describing it. But trying to think of a more concrete example, like science, maybe like the scientific method. In its infancy, like we had so many mistaken notions of what was scientifically true, and we still do, right? Like we're still not perfect, and so you subdue powers of darkness, and then the famine sort of comes after. I sort of read it as I probably read too much into it.
No, that makes sense.
But like you subdue these powers of darkness, and for a while things don't work. So there's like the bull of heaven comes down, but then eventually the bull of heaven is killed as well.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Like it's not like as soon as Gilgamesh kills Humbaba, he just is glorified and has an immortal name. Like that's not how anything works. It's not like you because also another thing of like while humans have the ability to know there is a future and like plan, there's not that direct access to the future. So even the thing that you think you want, maybe not is like is almost definitely not the thing that is actually the path to what you want. Like Gilgamesh wants glory, and he thinks the thing that will get him glory is killing Humbaba. So he kills Humbaba, but it's not like he just has glory immediately because that action wasn't the only or even the right path to that glory. He has to do something else to get glory. And also like there's no certainty that what you want is even possible or that it even is the right thing to want. Like wanting glory is what that's like Gilgamesh's ideal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's a real thing. Two, it doesn't mean it's actually the right thing to want. There could, and then like this is kind of like toward the end of the story, but like after he goes through this whole cycle of trying to seek immortality, he comes back to Uruk and is just kind of like, yeah, this is a good city, and that's kind of all you can say. Like there's not some perfect immortal glory to chase that you can actually attain. Like maybe the best thing you can do is just live in your city and just be happy with that. And so I think it's also kind of just like an iteration of that people don't know what is best for them, even though they think they do.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally right, because you see, like, you could read Humbaba through a different lens, like maybe the oppressive system, or like what exists now, the framework that exists right now that is oppressive to you and your ideas. Gilgamesh attacks it and unleashes chaos. And you see that like in the destruction of a belief system, right? Like the death of God, Nietzsche, the death of God. Yeah, like, and then like that's basically it. Most of Nietzsche's philosophy is talking about like how do we come back from this?
Right.
You know, like how do we face the fires of what we have unleashed?
We killed the guardian of the forest.
Yeah, sure.
And there's not enough.
The guardian of, yeah.
Humbaba is dead, and we have killed him.
Yeah, like you've taken this action because you've been driven to do it, but you don't really. It's not conducive to the greater good yet, and you don't really know what to do. And I think that's what the bull of heaven represents. It's like, dude, you killed the order. Now look at what you've done. And then he kills the thing that is sent as retribution. And then Enkidu must die. What do you make of that?
Oh yes, this is I don't know what to make of it. I can try. Let's see. So one thing, okay, so like a couple things with things we talked about earlier. So on one hand, Enkidu is in some way the other half of Gilgamesh. Like they're bonded, they are one. And so half of him dies. And I was thinking about that in relation to other stories, which we'll talk about later. But this whole sequence is similar-ish to when Patroclus dies in the Iliad, and Achilles is like, obviously he's like destroyed by Patroclus's death. But then that death is what pushes him to go back into the fight and to try to destroy Troy, to try to outlive mortality. It's very similar there. So that's part of it, is like the realization of death being a real thing that will happen to you as the motivator for the greatest action you can take. Like Gilgamesh knows that death is a thing because he kills, but he hasn't, up until the death of Enkidu, he hasn't understood that death is a thing that will also happen to him, because he sees Enkidu as his equal, as his other part. And so when Enkidu dies, part of him dies, he realizes he will also die. That's what, so at first I kind of liked that it sent him into this like horrible mourning depression. It wasn't just like he saw that his friend died and then that just led him into action. Like it led him into depression first. That emotional response kind of, it made Gilgamesh a lot, it makes him human. Like that is the human, is being so affected emotionally. And that's what comes before then rising again to go on that journey. So yeah, it's kind of some opening.
Yeah, it was the transition from Gilgamesh, the feisty, like idealist, just like, let's tackle everything, even though it might not be good for us.
Yeah.
And he's sent into this depression because he realized that the predicament of his existence, mm-hmm. and then also, like you said, the death of self that's required as a sacrifice for great action. Because Enkidu, portrayed as kind of the other half of Gilgamesh, mm-hmm. he had to die. It's like the gods just said he has to die. There's no like he has to die because, mm-hmm. I don't know. There's like he has to die. They killed the bull of heaven. He has to die.
Right.
So then Gilgamesh loses that part of himself, and then he's like lamenting for, I think the line is like, until the worm was hooked onto his corpse or something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just like absolutely broken. Mm-hmm. But you see this intense connection to feeling and like existence that wasn't necessarily there before. Like Gilgamesh was a tyrannical leader, sort of abused his power, didn't understand empathy, it seems, or like didn't really understand to relate to others and how to feel things and like interact with existence in like a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And it's almost through the death of Enkidu, he's just, and the destruction that causes him, it leads him to realize like the predicament of his existence, but also leads him into like eventually into like an appreciation of life, mm-hmm. that you don't really see in the beginning, which I think is fascinating.
Right.
And also you see, this is kind of an aside, but Gilgamesh refuses to be married to Ishtar, the goddess of love.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's and Ishtar is like pissed because he won't consent to like her wooing him, mm-hmm. which isn't. I didn't really understand that at all. Because like, what, he's gonna marry a god, the goddess of love, who's made. It's like made fools of everybody she's been a lover with.
Yeah.
It's like, what? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't have a good interpretation of that right now. It is, we didn't note this. It's like the bull of heaven doesn't just randomly show up. Like after Gilgamesh rejects Ishtar, then Ishtar asks Anu for the Bull of Heaven to destroy Gilgamesh. So like the Bull of
Yeah.
Heaven, it's not retribution for killing Humbaba. It's retribution for Gilgamesh rejecting the gods or rejecting the
Sure.
like
Yeah.
a goddess. And yeah, I don't know what that means. Like maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe there's something with like I was gonna say humility, but like Gilgamesh is not humble in any way. Like not like Gilgamesh knowing his place in some way, like knowing that he isn't God enough to marry a goddess. But I don't know,
Mm.
that's not really a good description of his character overall. And it's not that's not even why he rejects her. He rejects her because apparently she's just like a terrible wife, and just like
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
like ruin his life. So it's I don't know what to make of that. But that rejection of the goddess is what leads to the Bull of Heaven coming down.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And then the quest for immortality.
Yes, the search for everlasting life. Yeah. Okay. This is a fun part. There's so like there's the imagery of his journey. Like, there's just so many parts of that to analyze. Where he goes through, what does he go through? This is on page 99, where he goes through the mountain. Like he goes through this tunnel in the mountain, and like I don't
Yeah.
how long's a league? I don't know how long a league is, but for 10 leagues, for 12 leagues, it's just dark. So I think of that as like a long time. But he's just
Yeah.
walking through this mountain tunnel. Can't see anything, just keeps walking, and that's just like, that's pretty metaphorical. You think you walk through
I'm
darkness.
gonna pull in some Jordan Peterson references because I mean you can't really miss it. Like he walks into the tunnel and it's just dark, and it gets darker and it gets darker, but he has to keep walking.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like Jonah in the Old Testament. Jonah, it's swallowed up in the belly of a whale for 3 days and spit out where he needs to be at the end of his journey through in the whale.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it as kind of like an initiation, like or like a preparatory act to be able to journey into like the garden of the gods. In the beginning, he has to defeat like man scorpions and lions, kills them all. They're sort of like guarding the mountains. Yeah, he goes through the tunnel and it's just like darkness, and then he feels the breeze and then light, and then he goes out, and all of a sudden he's in this absolutely sublime garden with emeralds and rubies and lush vegetation, and it's just amazing.
Mm-hmm. And that leads to meeting Siduri, and this is definitely one of my favorite parts on 101 and 102, where he meets Siduri and she asks him, if you're Gilgamesh and you've killed the Bull of Heaven, you killed Humbaba, you killed the lions, like why are you so sad? Why is that not fulfilling for you? Why are you not happy? And then Gilgamesh says, because I will die, because my brother Enkidu died, and I will die as well, so I want everlasting life. And then, the best part of the story, on 102, Siduri says, Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things, day and night and day, dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. So
there you go.
And that's it. And that's in some ways that's kind of I remember in John Gill's existential philosophy class, we did like existentialism before existentialism, and one of the what's his name, the Egyptian Imhotep. Imhotep's like a old Egyptian philosopher king, and he had this one inscription of basically the human will die, the bones will rot away, so while you're alive, eat, drink, and be merry and dance and just enjoy life, and that's kind of like the best you can do. And so this is almost like Sumerian existentialism. Like there's no immortality, there's no afterlife, you'll die and that'll be it. So while you're here, just appreciate and cherish life, and that's the best you can do. Because even your achievements aren't fulfilling. Like clearly, like you achieved things that no other man could, and that the gods couldn't even do. You killed Humbaba, you killed the bull of heaven, and that's not even, those achievements aren't fulfilling because they're not permanent, and nothing is permanent. But the love you can experience on earth and the joy you can experience on earth, that's kind of the best you can do. So just be happy with that.
And then Gilgamesh totally ignores him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, so Siduri is like a bar, like it's a bar that she runs. It's like described as
Yeah. The maker of
like
wine.
wine.
Yeah.
Yeah. What?
He goes to the.
What is that doing? What is that doing on the shores of the primordial like sea? Because this is the Garden of the Gods. There's a bar right next to the ocean, which is like obviously symbolic since it's in the Garden of the Gods. Like, and it's the uncrossable ocean on which Gilgamesh has to cross.
It's a metaphor for going to the bar.
Yeah. But like, I mean, yeah, she runs the bar and she's like, yeah, just have a good time. Just have a good time. Have a drink.
Another thing about that quote I just read about the lot of man, how the lot of man is death, but it's also life between death. And that was something I was thinking about. I feel like this was more in relation to like Greek gods. It's from the Iliad, where I forget who fights Ares. It might be Achilles. I think Achilles fights Ares and like injures him like horribly. But the thing is that Ares is immortal, so he has to like live with this like horrible injury for a while, and like he'll eventually heal, but like he just can't die, so he has to live in pain for a long time. And how that's the difference between being mortal and immortal, and how immortality, like literally think about like an infinite life. Each little moment is somewhat insignificant because it doesn't have a grander point in the plot of the narrative of your life. Or when you're mortal, like every point is a narrative point, and it has meaning because it's in relation to the rest of your life. And if like the human mind is designed around knowledge of that mortality, like the most base thing we know is that we are mortal and that our actions are in some way like staving off death, then each action is in relation to that eventual death. But when you don't have that, that makes each moment so much less significant. Where like a big like life philosophy thing that I like think about is like making survival meaningful. That like if your life is literally based around survival, then your actions have to be meaningful in relation to survival. So that's like health. That's like being healthy is meaningful because it's staving off death. But when you don't have that death to like relate actions to, that feels like a meaningless life because there's nothing in relation that actions are in relation to. So like the lot of man is in some way a meaningful life because the lot of man is death.
Well, there's no reason to have a narrative if your life is infinite.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because there's no, like the nature of it is beginnings and ends. Mm-hmm. There can be no story if there's no beginning and end.
Right.
It's like there can be no light without darkness. Mm-hmm. It's just like opposites have to exist for anything in between to be able to exist. You know, like good and evil, love and hate, like all that stuff. Like one must exist in order for the other to exist. And if both don't exist, then you have nothing. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Then Gilgamesh journeys. Well, he breaks the guy's boat. The Shinabi, the ferryman. He gets mad and then breaks his boat.
He's just not a nice person.
But yeah, so they cross the sea and then they meet King Utnapishtim. And this is where they start talking about the flood.
Oh, yes.
Which was fascinating because it's so similar to to the flood in the Old Testament, um, on a little bit smaller scale, but like, um,
One thing that is, this is all, Wesley Cecil pointed this out in this same lecture that I talked about earlier. It's just so funny that the reason why the gods kill humans is because they're too loud.
yeah,
Like, it's not because they're sinning, it's not because they're wicked, it's just the uproar of mankind is intolerable and sleep is no longer possible. And so, like that's the reason that the humans have to die. They're too loud and the gods can't sleep. That's just funny.
yeah, that that's pretty funny. I didn't really read. That did stand out to me. It's kind of funny.
And I don't know, it makes sense. Like, the most annoying thing to me sometimes is like trying to be in a quiet space to like think, and there's noise. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
I would flood the earth if the library's too loud.
yeah, um, yeah. There's no real reason. It just seems like a primitive explanation of what's happened. Like they don't really. I mean, the flood narrative is so universal that like I think it's acknowledged. I'm not sure if it's acknowledged like in a scholarly manner that like that actually happened. And all of these narratives are like different ways of explaining something that actually happened. Like kind of what we were talking about earlier
Yeah.
with the historicity of myth. Um, but also you can read it into it's like all the ancients thought of like primordial waters as like the stuff that was made like comprised the earth, comprised existence. Not actual water, but like some primordial substance which had in its nature chaos and had in its nature like symbols that water represented. And so the flood is the sort of waters of sweeping waters of chaos that destroy humankind, and then there's one person who has this
Yeah.
who that symbolizes maybe civilization or the antidote to some chaos. And but the interesting thing is so the gods they decide to have this flood and they kill everyone, but Utnapishtim survives and then sacrifices, and then the gods swarm around the sacrifice like flies, it says. Which is fascinating because on the one, like they kill all human beings, but they're still in need of the sacrifices and the supplications of human beings, or they desire them at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they're like sort of remorseful.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a mistake. Like they're like, we're never doing this again. That was a horrible idea. And that's another thing.
So
Like the gods in this story they're very flawed. Like they're very imperfect. Like like Gilgamesh can do things that the gods can't, that they don't understand. Then here they just make a mistake. Like they kill the humans, and then maybe they realize, maybe part of it is like they realize that they need the humans to sacrifice to them, and they need the humans like for something. Maybe because, I mean, kind of maybe again like in like the Greek sense, like for like entertainment, like they need the humans to like make their immortal lives meaningful. Like watching and interfering with and toying with the humans' lives is what makes the gods' immortal existence have any purpose. And so like they just make a mistake, and that's kind of they're not perfect, omnipotent deities. They're just like very powerful beings who make mistakes.
Very different. I was listening to Michael Sagru again. He was talking about Gilgamesh in relation. Lecture series was like the Bible in Western culture, and he was talking about the Gilgamesh epic in relation to Noah's flood. And he was talking about the development of idea of God, because in Judaism you had Yahweh, monotheistic God, and then in this story you're in a polytheistic pantheon, many different gods, different conceptions of how God's work in the world. And it's just fascinating because you see how the stories build off one another. And he was talking about how the development of Noah's flood was actually in a reaction to like the incompleteness of the Gilgamesh floods narrative, which is a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but it was an interesting point that he brought up because you do see those aspects of imperfection in the story. Like, obviously, like we talked about earlier, it might not be a complete narrative just due to the nature of the archaeology and the fact that it was written 3,000 years ago on clay tablets. But like, you do see the sort of incomplete, like especially after like Utnapishtim is done telling Gilgamesh about the story, he's like, oh, and there's this plant that will give you immortality. Gilgamesh finds it, and then it's stolen by a serpent, and then the story ends.
Yeah.
It's like, it's sort of like an incomplete and unfulfilling narrative that you don't really know what to make.
Yeah.
But like, and then the thing is like the serpent stole the plant, so that's why serpents shed their skin. It's like, all right, cool, the end. Yeah, I didn't really know what to say. It's kind of funny. He just talked about how there's so much missing from the narrative, it seems, at the end, especially at the end.
Yeah, the end kind of does move pretty fast.
You don't really know how to interpret it, especially in light of the like the rest of the story. Like Enkidu is gone. There's all of the themes surrounding him sort of go away, and then you have the search for immortality, which is destined to fail, obviously, and it does. And then you get to the end, and it's just like,
well, like ultimately, he like learns to appreciate the city, and like in the way the story started with the physical description of the city, and then it returns to that of how solid the foundation is and how well the brickwork is, and that it was the 7 wise men who laid the foundation, and so one thing with that is he moves away from the self-centered, I want to be immortal, I want my name to be immortal. That was like his first attitude. And then when he comes back, it's more an attitude of like community and the greater civilization of Uruk. And that's what's more important to him. So it moves from individual to society. And that's how, and also like if you think about this like as like political propaganda, like why this story would be maybe like allowed to be told, why this story like continued is because ultimately this is a story of glorifying the greater civilization and kind of like the opposite of like Western Enlightenment, like individual focused freedoms. Like this is kind of the reversal of that story. It's moving from the individual to the society rather than from the society to the individual, like finding themselves. Like the individual finds himself in the strength of the society. And so that makes sense like on a historical level. Like in order for a civilization to last, the individuals have in some way to like value that over themselves. Like
and
a little bit.
The aspect of self-sacrifice in society, like Gilgamesh, he has this quest for immortality. It comes to no avail. But in a way, like his journeys were aimed at the betterment of society, it seems, or like his kingship, his destiny was to just better society, order Uruk, make it prosper. And in the end, he has to accept that. So he has to sacrifice that part of himself yet again that desires immortality, which is always there. But it's like you're talking about the acknowledgement of society as a whole. And I think at the end it talks about like um, the gods like ordained this destiny for him. Um, like this was your destiny to. The destiny was fulfilled with which the father of the gods and of the mountain had decreed for Gilgamesh. Um, yeah, he was given kingship. Everlasting life was not his destiny. Um, yeah, and that gets back to the speech that Siduri had earlier in his quest for everlasting life. Just enjoy it, man. But there's again the paradox of if we're just enjoying it, like why act? Why have empathy? Why strive for the betterment of society? So there's that coming together of opposites where like you could just not do that and things would be hell. There's for some reason there's this tendency to strive against the grain for the betterment of other people. That seems to be like the proper way to be, the proper way to act in light of the estrangement of human beings. And I think that's what this is conveying. Like it is conveying like enjoy life, but it also is putting Gilgamesh on this pedestal because he went on that journey and brought new things to Uruk and sublimated the powers of evil. Maybe to no avail, he still went on that quest. So I think it is saying that, like, enjoy it, but like to enjoy it, there's a direction that needs to be taken, and this is it. The sort of self-sacrifice to society, for society. That's like the optimal way of being or the optimal posture of existence of a human being.
Yeah. I'm also thinking kind of I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a Sumerian 4,000 years ago listening to this story. Like what
Sure.
do I or do you like see yourself as Gilgamesh in the story? And you can think of it as like literally like is the duty of man to go on a quest and try to do great things no one has before? That's like one option. Or is it like a metaphorical Gilgamesh, like you face the mountains and evils of your own life, and even if that mountain and evil is like your job that day, but you have to like face it with like courage. So there's that. Or is this more like a superhero story, like almost like an Ubermensch, like some great men do these great things. Most men just kind of hang out and will live and die. And so like this is more like an entertainment story where it's like fulfilling, like mentally you can fulfill those desires that you literally couldn't do because you're not a great man, but it's kind of just like an entertainment to help you get through your more ordinary, boring life. And that's not a fun way to think about it. But there's just like a lot of different ways to think about the story, like in that way.
I didn't think about it like the last one you mentioned. How is this like a fantasy? Because Gilgamesh was a king. Like it was. I think he was like a historically real person.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, like his description, that 2/3 God, 1/3 man, the perfection of his appearance, the perfection of his intellect, does set him apart. But I think him being placed on a pedestal is the sort of maybe a sort of ideal that's sublimated out of years of culture, the however many years of culture they've been on this experiment of civilization. Obviously, they're still in the dawning age of it when this was written. But I don't know if I see it as like this like just an ordained thing for the one guy alone. I think I would if there was more mention of like a common man in relation to him being placed on a pedestal. Like because there's just like, this is Gilgamesh, like he's great, he's perfect.
Yeah.
And there's no like, the only times they mention like common people is like when they're sort of like, dude, you can't go fight Humbaba, like that's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
um, so I think, yeah, I mean, I guess we don't know, like it's thousands of years removed from its authorship, like, and I don't have a PhD in Sumerian study and literature, but like to me it read as a sort of metaphorical allegory to just the things you face in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're getting back to the psychological narrative with Enkidu, that struck me as very like how do you reconcile the self amongst the estrangement of existence and the paradox of death and life, and like what do you do? Why would you act?
Mm-hmm.
But it also struck me as like the beginnings of the self in relation to others, to civilization. Like Gilgamesh was just tyrannical and oppressive until he went on this journey, and then he became a greater king.
Mm-hmm. And also with
So
that,
it's like,
sorry,
yeah, it's like this. It sort of implores, to me at least, the fact that there is a calling each person has that manifests itself in different ways, that tests you, that breaks you and builds you back up, and that at the end of the day, it gives you the correct posture in which to live if you follow it wholeheartedly and fully.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of a Sumerian. Like you think about their life and how like terrible it was in compared to our
Sure.
posh existence where everything is
Yeah.
essentially provided and we don't have to fear of dying of a foot infection tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah. One thing, kind of with that, like almost like takeaways. So, with the idea of Gilgamesh and Enkidu as the two-part self, like Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is ultimately better as a result. Because like the original thing I said is that the ideal, like what this story is saying is that the divine mind, the divine self, and the animal self have to love each other as equals, and that's true up until Enkidu dies, and then that's what motivates Gilgamesh on his quest. But kind of like Gilgamesh abandoning the quest is in some way like closing the book on Enkidu and like accepting that and accepting the death of the animal human. And so the best king version of Gilgamesh at the end, where he's grateful for the city, that's only Gilgamesh. There's no Enkidu left in him. And so in some way, like it's also, this story is also a progression of humans from let's like the divine and the animal being separate, to them being joined and loving each other, to the animal then dying, and the divine side of the human manifesting as the community focused individual. And that's what we're left with. And so that's different than what I said earlier, but that's, and I don't know, like that also doesn't seem like, I don't love that idea. Like I don't love the idea of like the animal aspect of humanity like dying, and that's what's best for humanity. But that's also kind of, it seems like that's what the story is kind of pointing to, is that in order for civilization to be at its best, at that animal side, it has to die.
Yeah, it's like, because in a way, Enkidu never meets Gilgamesh in his fully like animalistic state. Like he's not
Sure.
fully Enkidu when him and Gilgamesh first wrestle, when they meet each other. So in a way, like that part of him is already kind of gone. But I think in relation to sacrifice and communal civilization, um, Gilgamesh maybe realizes through his relationship with Enkidu, um, who is more in the moment right now, pleasing of desires, maybe that sort of sentiment. Like, I don't know if it's like a complete death of what Enkidu represents, but it's like a unification and then sort of trimming
Sure. Yeah.
of those parts of him that don't fulfill what society calls him to do.
Yeah, because
They don't.
the mental state
Yeah.
of like appreciation of the moment, that's kind of where Gilgamesh is left with, of not being so fixed on the future, of being appreciative of the moment. And that's how we described Enkidu earlier on.
But it's like a balance of the two, right? Like he's still able to be a king and be a leader, and he's still wise and knows mysteries and secrets. But he has this connection, appreciation. That's a sort of sublimation of the two, almost like he's right on the line. Now, like at first he was oppressive. You can see the sort of oppressive nature of rationality and like us naming things and us being anthropocentric human beings. But then you all have that part of Enkidu that is like naturalistic, animal, sort of creative aspect. That's maybe you could relate that to like hippie culture or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like open-minded creativeness.
Sure. So
And it's like,
more the incorporation
yeah,
of Enkidu into Gilgamesh.
to the point where he realizes like the sacrifice that's required of him given his allotted destiny, something like that.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think it's like a deep insight into the paradox of human existence. Like, how must we act given the nature of death? How must we act given the nature of, our estrangement, our individual existences in relation to others?
Yeah. Those are kind of all my thoughts. Yeah, I drained my coffee. I got nothing left to sip.
There you go.
You have any parting thoughts? Because I've kind of already dispensed my thoughts. Or anywhere else to take us? Or is that it?
That's all I got.
All right.
Stay tuned for the next episode.
Absolutely.